All right, and we are live, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we're all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world, and we are so excited that you guys are continuing to join us on YouTube as we highlight amazing science and exploration from across the globe. A week or so ago, 2 weeks ago, we were joined for the first time by the Friends of the Rouge Watershed team. And so they took us on a virtual tree planting, which was wildly popular, one of the most popular sessions we've ever had, as we explored this amazing place in Eastern Ontario and got a chance to do a live tree planting live on screen and hopefully inspired you guys to do some more great stuff at home while you're stuck there. Today, we are joined by the team again. So Jim and Danielle are joining us today, and they're going to walk us around the Rouge Watershed to explore spring ephemerals. As you guys have maybe been doing social distance walks outside, you've seen some beautiful flowers over the last few weeks. Today, we're going to explore some of Ontario's most beautiful flowers and get a little bit of an amazing tour from Jim. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Jim, and take us away.
Okay, thank you very much, Jesse. Thank you for having us on Explore by the Seat of Your Pants. My name is Jim Robb, and Danielle Marcoux will be on the camera today with our social distancing. And we're out here in the beautiful Rouge River watershed on the edge of Toronto. It's part of a national park now that extends all the way from Lake Ontario to the Oak Ridges Moraine, some 25 kilometers. And today we're going to be showing you some of the beautiful spring wildflowers that are found in this area. Before we start, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement. The land that we're here and the waters that are here, Native people have been here for thousands of years. They've taken care of this place. When the Native people were here, the water was so clean you could drink it. There were so many fish that there was plentiful food for people, healthy food for people to eat. So some of the people that were here before us that we want to pay respect and acknowledge their lands is the Mississauga, the New Credit, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee. And they were people that lived off this land in a sustainable way, and they left us 90% of it natural. And in the last 200 years, we've taken quite a bit away, and we've taken 90% of the naturalists away. And scientists are telling us we have to put some of those natural areas back to have a stable climate, clean air, and healthy communities. So let's get started on our nature walk. We'll tell you a little bit of stories as we're walking. But the first flower I'd like to, Danielle, to show you is the trout lily. Now the trout lily has beautiful yellow petals, and it has a green leaves with a kind of a mottled brownish red color on it. And people say that the mottled brownish on the green is similar to trout when they're coming up to spawn. And they happen to bloom right at the time when native trout and introduced rainbow trout come up the stream to spawn in the Rouge. In fact, Danielle and I yesterday saw 4 or 5 beautiful rainbow trout with a red band on their bodies coming up to spawn. So this is the trout lily. We'll now move down a little bit of a ways. We'll see if we can find some trilliums for you. The major trilliums people see are usually the white trillium in southern Ontario, and a little further north, the red trillium. In the Rouge, we're lucky to have both. The first one we're going to look at today is the red trillium. It has a beautiful reddish purple flower with 3 beautiful purplish petals surrounded by 3 beautiful green leaves. And hence the name trillium, tri for 3. Trilliums have 3 leaves and 3 petals. There are also painted trilliums further north. They are like the white trillium, but they have a sort of pinkish red triangle in the center of the leaves. And there's the nodding trillium, which is like the native white trillium, but the flowers kind of nod down. So this is the red trillium. We'll now take a look at some white trilliums. They're not fully out yet. It's been a cool spring. Spring started off really quickly in the Rouge. The red-winged blackbirds were back about 2 weeks early, around the 1st, 2nd of March. Usually they get back in mid-March, but then it turned cool. And so the flowers today are a little bit behind their normal blooming. But in another week, this will be carpeted with white trilliums and trout lilies. That's the white trillium. That's our provincial flower, by the way. The next plant we'll take a look at is early meadow rue. Now, early meadow root has a very tiny little flower. It might not be out yet. It's kind of just little greenish flower with little tiny yellow stamens dangling down, sort of like um, little threads, and probably not there yet, but you can see they have these trifoliate or three kind of leaf pattern, and they're very delicate and beautiful, and that's called early meadow rue. Now we'll move down this beautiful pathway a little bit further. One of the things that's really important when you're out in a natural area is to stay on the path, because these little vernal or ephemeral wildflowers, they have to gather all the sunlight they can in a very short period. And if you go into the leaves, you might not see them and you'll step on their heads and you could kill them. So you want to stay on the path so that the little wildflowers stay healthy and come back each year. These wildflowers are perennials, which means they do come back every year. We're now amidst some beautiful white pine here. When the Rouge, before the settlers arrived and started clearing, there were huge stands of 1.5 meter, 2 meter diameter white pine and sugar maple and oak trees. And this is a beautiful mixture between the Great Lakes forest and even a bit of Carolinian forest component. The next plant we're going to look at, Danielle's going to come and take a look at the blue coalhush. Blue coalhush also has very tiny little flowers that might not be fully out yet, with little yellow petals and stamens, greenish, purplish flowers actually. But you can see this beautiful purpley hue. And native people use many of these plants for remedies. But remember, a lot of these plants can be poisonous, so you never want to eat them. But native people use these plants, and even midwives who help deliver babies use this, an extract from coalhush, to help in the delivery process. We'll move on a little further. These little green leaves scattered throughout the forest floor, they're not blooming yet, but this is actually called lily of the valley. I think the Latin name is Mayapple canadense. They come up with a beautiful little group of little creamy white bell-shaped flowers. And one of the things that's so neat about these lily of the valley is that they smell just beautiful. They have a lovely fragrance. Here's a white pine tree, our provincial tree. This one's probably only about 75 centimeters. Just imagine ones that were 1.5 to 2 meters in diameter and 40 meters high, like 15 stories high. Beautiful provincial tree, eastern white pine. Our next little, we're a little early, so we'll get you flowers, but not all of these have them yet. The next little plant we're going to look at is called twisted stalk. So the stalk sort of zigzags a little bit, and these leaves project out from it. And then right where the leaves join the stem, Danielle will show you a little tiny bulb that's going to be the flower. And eventually, once the flower blooms and dies back, there'll be a little red berry there. So it's very pretty to see this plant when it's fully flushed out, and little red berries at each of the points where the leaves join the stem. And it's called twisted stalk. We'll go a little further along the path. Now we're getting into a beautiful glade of cedars, and you can feel the coolness of the air. And scientists are telling us that if we can put back 1 billion hectares of forest cover on the earth, we can actually absorb more than half of the carbon dioxide that's causing our climate to get chaotic and more costly in terms of floods. So forests are really important for mitigating the effects of climate change. And this is all these trees, this is stored carbon. Trees absorb sunlight and they absorb carbon dioxide from the air. And through the magic of photosynthesis, they turn it into wood. This is a plant I especially like here that Danielle's going to get down and take a picture of. This is bloodroot. Bloodroot, as the name says, the stem and the roots of this exude a red sap that native people could use to paint their face, or they could use it to dye fabrics or clothing. If you notice, it's kind of cool. The the leaf, when the flower comes up, the leaf cups around it quite often and keeps it in kind of a little bit of a greenhouse, keeps it warmer and keeps it sort of collects the sunlight. And the leaf is sort of looks like the leaf of a fig. And then the flowers, these beautiful white petals with a yellow center. And that's called bloodroot. Bloodroot's one of the first wildflowers to come out in the spring. And the petals are very delicate. And as soon as they open up for a few days, the wind will actually blow them off. And the leaves try to keep them on long enough to attract pollinators. The leaves provide them with a little shelter. We're now going back into a beautiful cedar glade for a little bit. In southern Ontario, it's said that when the settlers first arrived in the 1500s, a squirrel could travel all the way from Quebec City to Windsor without ever touching the ground. Now, clearly there's rivers to cross and things, but basically most of southern Ontario and southern Quebec were beautiful old growth forests. And about 1800, we began to settle them, and we went a little overboard, and we've removed about 75 to 85% of those forests are all gone now. And when we removed all the forests, the water, instead of going into the ground and replenishing these deep aquifers that give you slow flow of water to the stream, what happened is the water all rushed off, polluted the streams, and the Atlantic salmon and a lot of the fish went extinct because they no longer had a slow, cool supply of water. They had a big rush all at once and then a dry period in the summer. So if we put back the forest, we'll have cleaner water, more biodiversity, a more stable climate. Now let's see, we're coming through the cedar glade a little further, and then we'll be coming in the cedar glade. You notice it's so shaded that there isn't too much growing here. And that's kind of the story of vernal herbs. Think of yourself as something quite small in a land of giants. All these trees are giants. They grow up really tall and they're the first to capture the sunlight. So the strategy of the vernal herbs is to live in areas where there's deciduous trees that lose their leaves. And in the springtime, it takes those big giants, the deciduous trees, a while to get going. So the little vernal herbs on the floor, they rush to get growing before the sunlight disappears under the shade of the canopy. So they have a strategy, and that strategy has served them well for millions of years. This is a little pale blue violet on the edge of the path here. Quite lovely. Another one of our early spring bloomers. We'll travel a little further down the path. You can see in a healthy forest, there are lots of fallen logs and trees. And those are the grandfather and grandmother trees, and they create habitat for their children to grow next to, and they improve the soil. So here's a little yellow violet actually right beside the path. Quite beautiful. Many varieties of wild violets. Now, as we move a little further, this isn't actually a flowering plant, but I thought I'd show it to you. Danielle's going to zoom in. This is called an ostrich fern. And some people might know that when they start out in that sort of bump there, that corm, and all the little leaves are rolled up into a tight circle. And in some parts of the country, they eat them. They call them fiddleheads, and they fry them up with some butter and garlic and stuff. But when you're in a natural area close to a city, you should only take away memories and photographs. Don't collect or cut flowers. If you cut some of these flowers, it'll weaken them enough that they may not bloom again. They could die. And if we collect fiddleheads, we're actually damaging these beautiful ostrich ferns that will grow 3 to 4 feet high. And this will be like a little, almost very tropical kind of richness here, where you have these huge ferns in another month and a half, they'll be 3 to 4 feet high. So if you're way out in the country and it's legal to do so, you could try a few fiddleheads, but you don't want to eat too many because apparently they have some chemicals in them that are known to be cancer causing. Now, we're going a little further, and this is one of the plants that's non-native. It's not flowering yet. Danielle's going to go down and take a picture of it. This is called garlic mustard. So garlic mustard came from Europe. People did use it to make a pesto, a garlicky, oniony pesto, but it's really bad in our woodlands because once it gets growing, it grows well in the shade and it exudes chemicals that actually harm the trilliums and the trout lilies and the roots of the native trees. So we really don't want to bring it in. And that's why staying on the path is really important too, because it's possible to go along the path and weed out the garlic mustard, but if it gets all in the forest, it's a really big job and it's hard to get rid of it. That's called garlic mustard. It will have a little white flower in about another 2 or 3 weeks. Non-native, invasive, not so good. Now we're out here to see wildflowers, but this is an interesting little thing. Sometimes you see a push-up mound of soil near a trail. And what that tells me is that push-up mound, there's been a little subterranean animal that's been burrowing beneath there. And it's probably something called a star-nosed mole. And they look like they have a little tiny, almost like a starfish attached to their snout. And they burrow underground and their tentacles from the front of their mouth help them to locate little things to eat like worms and invertebrates and insects. Star-nosed vole tunnel or mole tunnel. How are we on our time, Jesse?
We're doing great for time. We probably got another 5 minutes, and then we might want to dive into Q&A from there, but this has been fantastic.
Okay, so Danielle will look at this one. Again, things are a little late this year because it started out, spring started fast and then turned cool. This is just a tiny little start of a really neat plant called a jack in the pulpit. So it's hard to see now, but it has 2 stems that come up with 3 little leaflets on each. And in the central area, it has something that kind of is like a long glass with a canopy over it. Picture if you curve your wrist down and your hand forward to create kind of like, looks like a cobra almost, a cobra kind of snake. It has this beautiful little covering and it'll get much bigger than that. Sometimes they can go 2 to 3 feet and it'll be striped with purple or dark and light green. One of the really fascinating things about this plant is they actually change from male to female every couple of years. And scientists are studying it because they want to know why and how they do it. The story I've heard is that the ladies out there should like this. It's so tough being a woman that after being a year or 2 of being a woman, they got to go back to being a man for 3 or 4 years because producing seed takes a lot of energy. So when they're female plants, they get really big and they have to produce lots of berries. You might have seen them in the fall. They have a big spike with all these orange berries and kind of like a little tall mountain, a Matterhorn of berries on top of a spike. So that takes a lot of energy. So now they're exhausted. So next year they might come back up as a male. And as a male, you only produce pollen. And pollen is like 1/1000th the size of a seed. So it's a lot less demanding. So this is jack in the pulpit. Interesting that it changes from male to female every few years. Jack in the pulpit, like most of these plants, likes rich soils with all the beautiful organic matter given to us from the leaves. This is another really interesting plant. This is called wild ginger. Wild ginger has 2 heart-shaped leaves, and it has a little bell-shaped purpley flower that lies right on the ground. And the reason the flower lies on the ground, it actually smells a bit like rotting flesh, and it attracts insects and flies and beetles that come in and take pollen from one flower to the other. So most flowers are up in the air a bit where the bees and things that get there. This flower lies on the ground. And wild ginger was used to spice foods for native people. Native people knew how to treat it, but if you don't treat it right, there's actually a chemical in it that can cause kidney failure. So some people tried to borrow the native uses of it, but they didn't treat it right. Native people would store it for a long time And then I think they would heat it a lot, and the heating got rid of the dangerous chemical, I think. But it's quite lovely. It does taste like ginger. This plant is called Mayapple that Danielle's going to come and.
Oh, our team got out from the Rouge Valley. Let's see if we can get him back. I'm sorry for that, guys. Sometimes we're doing walks in the middle of a forest. It disappears. I'm going to email them really quickly, see if we can get him back. And thanks for your patience, but I hope you guys are enjoying that as much as I was. I've certainly learned a lot in the last few minutes. It just popped in for a second there. Quick note while we're waiting to get them back. I know Jim started the presentation with the land acknowledgement, but I think it's been really nice to highlight some of the indigenous uses of native wildflowers and plants. It's been really exciting to see that and how it's changed over time. Danielle's back.
Oh, great. So sorry about that, guys. I don't know what happened, but this is Mayapple. If it's going to flower, it'll have two big umbrella leaves with a wide joint at the stem, and a little white flower with, I think, 5 petals will come out from there, and little yellow stamens. And it'll produce a tiny little fruit, sort of the shape of a lemon more than an apple. And when that fruit's yellow, the animals like to eat it, and that when it's green, it's poisonous. So that's Mayapple. The flowers aren't out yet. Again, we're a little bit early, but you can see those big umbrella-shaped leaves. And right where the two of them join, there'll be a white flower. If it only has one leaf, that means it's not going to produce a flower that year. So we're going to go a little further. Oh, here's a beautiful bloodroot right beside the path that kind of shows the way the leaf is cupped right around the flower to protect it, because the little petals, they really fall off in the wind really easily. Little click. Sorry, I ran into a tree. The tree's standing there. Now we're right near the end here. One of the last flowers we'll be showing you is one of my favorites also. It's called hepatica. The common name is liver leaf because the leaf has sort of a purplish color like the human liver, and it's 3-lobed. It has 3-lobed, sort of a little bit like the human liver. So here we are. When hepatica comes up, the stems come out and the flowers first, and they're covered in a fine hair called pubescence, beautiful. And then these 3-lobed leaves come out, and you could kind of see the purpley color, which is similar to the color of the human liver, and you could see the 3-lobed. There's a round leafed variety, and this is the sharp lobed variety, hepatica or liver leaf. So Jesse, I think we're ready for questions if people have them, or to talk a little bit more. And thank you so much for everyone for coming out for a wildflower walk in the Rouge to see these amazing little creatures that come up before the leaves are on the tree for about a month in late April, early May, when they can capture sunlight and grow, and then they go to sleep.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Jim, for literally our first ever large-scale nature walk we've ever had in this program. The feedback's been tremendous on YouTube already, so thanks for everyone for tuning in. So we're going to start with a simple question. So we've got Miss Wright's group joining us in Nescoin, Oregon, and Miles in her class wanted to know, are the red trilliums you started with rare?
The red trilliums aren't that rare in this area of the country in Eastern North America. I'm not actually sure of their occurrence out west. If you're interested in wildflowers for your gardens, you want to contact a reputable nursery, and some of them grow it in a conscientious way that they don't dig it up and steal it from somewhere. They actually grow it, and you can get these local flowers, and they do really nice in home gardens in semi-shade, but you have to check with your local experts, the wildflower experts in your area. But red trillium is fairly common in little further north than Toronto, say up around Haliburton and Algonquin. It's a little less common in the city of Toronto area.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jim. All right, I'm going to go to Zeke and Joe joining us live at home in Mount Orb, Wisconsin. If you guys have a question for Jim, come on up. Let's just demute your mic and you're good to go.
When do you get interested and why do you get interested about learning about flowers and plants?
Yeah, perfect.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Well, that's a great question. My parents, I guess, encouraged me, my mother in particular, to love nature, and it's a lifelong learning process. That's if you learn to explore and enjoy, it's a really exciting thing to do for your entire life from when you're very young. I guess one of my first great things is I caught a butterfly in the Toronto area when I was about 9, and it had a little white tag, and it said UT, and it had a phone number, University of Toronto. And my mother called, and it was Dr. Urquhart, and he was trying to put little tags on the butterflies to see where they went. And so I was able to tag monarch butterflies, and eventually Dr. Urquhart, with thousands of other volunteers, people would put a little tag on them and where they released them, and then they'd catch them. Someone else would catch them somewhere else and report it, and they'd draw a line between the two spots, and those joined dots would funnel them down to where he found where millions of monarchs overwinter in the Mexican mountains. They migrate there and then they hibernate there. That was one of my early experiences.
What a beautiful story, Jim. I think for people at home, that's just a great general story, is, you know, being connected with science and how citizen science works in a community. For those of you who know about that, doctor, and the work to understand monarch migrations, that's even cooler. So it's a very layered, nice tale. Thanks, Jim. All right. We've got a group online that wants to know about a specific tree. So are the pollinators of wild ginger similar to those that pollinate pawpaw trees? So they've heard that pawpaws are pollinated by beetles, and I guess they want to know if ginger is pollinated by beetles as well, or if anything else that you might know.
Yes, a pawpaw is one of those Carolinian trees that just makes it into southern Ontario, and apparently the fruit is really tasty, and native people used it. The climate's changing, so we may be actually able to have pawpaw in the Rouge long term, but I don't know specifically if they're the same beetle, but definitely beetles and flies and ants pollinate the ginger plant, and I would expect that similar things happen with the pawpaw.
Yeah, fantastic. You had mentioned earlier, so some of the plants, you mentioned the one that smells like rotting flesh that attracts flies. Now, we've understood from some of our past programs that different flowers and their colors attract different insects. Can you tell us a little bit about what different flowers might do to attract different things?
Well, insects see in a different color spectrum than you do. They have a much wider spectrum, so they can see in the ultraviolet. So when you and I look at a white trillium, we might only see the white petals, but to a bee or something, they might actually see kind of like a landing strip marking a beautiful ultraviolet color right in the center where that flower wants the insect to land to pick up pollen. And there's an interesting story about willows. Willows have sort of primitive flowers on them, and the males are sort of brighter than the females. They're kind of reddish and in color, and the females are green. And if you think about it, it makes sense because they want the bees to go to the male flower first to pick up the pollen, and then when they go to the female flower second, they will put the pollen on the female part and they'll produce seeds.
Fantastic. All right. Ms. Huxley joining us in Brampton, Ontario wants to know, how did scientists figure out that the jack and the pulpit plants change between male and female fruits or male and female every few years? How do we?
I'm not sure the answer to that, but I would suspect it was probably started with a scientist who was also a naturalist who had a patch of jack and the pulpits that he watched and noticed that some years they produced the pollen and then some years they produced the beautiful big orange seeds of the females. So somebody noticed that, and the scientists then went and studied it, and they laid out quadrants and they tested the plants, and they figured out that yes, in fact, these plants are changing. And if you go online, there's actually a number of scientific studies online that talk about the jack and the pulpit, and they still haven't fully figured it out, but how and why it switches from male to female.
Very cool. Now, so male and female flowers, this is something that I was struck by when you talked about it. Aren't a lot of plants both male and female at the same time, or are all ephemerals one or the other?
Yes, a lot of plants do have male and female parts. So think about it on trees. So what happens on trees is that the female cones, like say that white pine tree, the female cones are very large and they're up at the top of the tree. And the male cones that produce pollen, they're down lower. And that way, when the pollen gets blown by the wind, it doesn't go onto the same tree. So it doesn't self-fertilize. It has to blow down, be picked up and go higher to a tree further down, hopefully not related. And then it pollinates it. So trees and some flowers have both. There are some plants and some trees that are actually, I can't remember the words, dioecious or monoecious. Anyways, they only have a male flower, a female flower. And poplar trees and willow trees, they have male trees and female trees. But there are some that have both male and female apparatus.
Excellent. For everyone tuning in at home too, I really encourage you guys, when you're done, if you get a chance, to look up The Private Life of Plants. So this is a book and a series made by the British Broadcasting Corporation, and is probably the most comprehensive and amazingly beautiful look at the wide world of plants. If you're inspired by Jim today, I urge you to check that out when you're done. All right, Emerson and London both wanted to ask Jim, what is the most common flower along the trail when you're walking?
Well, one of the most noticeable ones you'll see in about another 2 or 3 weeks on some trails are the white trilliums. In this particular part of Ontario, in some forests, it'll be like this beautiful mosaic of like a quilt of beautiful patches of trillium, then a little spaces of trout lilies. So they are one of the most noticeable, and they're one of the bigger and more showy wildflowers. So I'd say the white trilliums, and in some places the red trilliums, are often the most noticeable.
Beautiful. All right, we're going to take a few more questions, everyone. Do you have a favorite flower? I know it's a hard thing to pick. Is there anything that jumps out for you personally?
You know, a friend of mine who's an ecologist was asked about that, and I thought his answer was so beautiful. He said that his favorite thing is when he's in an area and he just knows that all the things that should be there, from the nondescript, the early meadow root to the showy painted trillium, that he can see they're there, and that makes them the happiest. And I think that's also applies for me. And scientists have a word for that, and they call it ecological integrity. And even if you're not a scientist, they've done studies with people, and if you walk a group of people with no scientific background through an area with lots of biodiversity, lots of different plants and animals, they will really appreciate that area more than if you walk them through an area with very few species. And the reason, I think, is deep in our brain. We know from when we were hunter-gatherers that where there was a great diversity of species, that's a good place to live, because there's different types of food, different types of medicines, and that's a healthy environment to live in. And human beings, we're really crushing the biodiversity of the earth, and we have to get smarter. We have to protect more areas, put back more forests and wetlands, so that this wonderful gift we're given of self-reproducing natural systems survives for our children and grandchildren.
That's a beautiful sentiment. And may I just say, as someone who lives in Toronto too, albeit in the other end of the city, I never knew that we had such a diversity of beautiful wildflowers. So I learned a lot today, and I certainly will appreciate it more when I'm walking and looking through the underbrush. So I appreciate that, Jim. All right, we want to go back to Zeke and Joe for a minute. If you guys have a second question, come on up, and then we'll take a couple more before we wrap up. So Zeke and Joe, if you guys have another one, go for it.
How do the
Could you repeat that? Sorry, guys, it cut out for a second there. Let's see. Oh, so Zeke and Joe, your audio is a little off. So what I'd love you to do is, if you could type that question in the chat bar, that would be great. I don't know why it's iffy, but I'm sorry that it is. And while you guys are typing in that question, I'll take one from Alana in Miss Wright's class. How many invasive species are in your park, Jim?
Far too many. Some of the worst ones are garlic mustard, because garlic mustard survives in the shade. A lot of invasive species like full sun, but garlic mustard's in the shade where the beautiful trees and native wildflowers are. And so it's actually displacing them in some areas, and it exudes a chemical that hurts them. If you go into some parts of Toronto that are more urban, probably 75 to 80% of the trees and wildflowers are non-native. They're not from Canada, they're from Europe, and they're invasive. They take over. Having plants and animals from other countries, if they're not invasive and they're not destructive, it's not the biggest problem. But we have garlic mustard, dog strangling vine, which is a vine that takes over beautiful meadows and strangles out the other plants. And we have a big, tall, beautiful grass, but very invasive, called Phragmites. So we probably have several hundred invasive species in the Rouge. And I think right now in the Rouge, we're probably about 65% native, 35% invasive. But in some parts of Toronto, the valleys are still beautiful, but they're 80, 90% invasives.
Wow, very, I mean, it's disconcerting, but it's something that we need to work on together. And I'm glad that you guys are doing the work you're doing to help change that sort of thing. Zeke and Joe wanted to type in, how do the jack and pulpits work? So I guess, how do they function? How does it, like, can we explain a little bit more about how they're, yeah.
Actually, I would have to do more research to find what happens, but plants have hormones just like human beings. So with human beings, estrogen, both men and women have estrogen and a little bit of testosterone, and the balance is how it makes the difference between a man or a woman. As men have more testosterone, perhaps women have a little more estrogen. And with the plants, I would assume there's some sort of a hormonal balance too. Plants do have hormones like cytokinins, gibberellins, and of auxins and a variety of other plant hormones. So I would think it'd be something to do with the balance in the plant hormones that switched on and off female or male.
Yeah.
But you could look online to find out more about it.
Yeah. Fantastic. So I encourage everyone to do that when they're done the program. Jim, we're going to wrap up with two quick questions. One is, you're obviously an extremely knowledgeable guide to this ecosystem and habitat. Is there a place that we can send kids, whether they're in Toronto or wherever they might be joining from in the world? Where would you recommend people to go to learn about the nature in their area? Is there a type of website? Is there an organization you'd like to recommend? Even if it's just local to Toronto that you can share, any resources would be great.
Yeah, so, well, you could visit the Friends of the Rouge website. We don't have a lot of information there, but they can tell you about how you can help the Rouge and how you can get involved in ecological restoration. At the Rouge Parks Canada is in charge of the Rouge National Urban Park, and I'm sure they have wonderful resources, and long-term they should be good custodians of this park. And I just wanted to say before we leave, this will be Mother's Day this Sunday, and we'd like to dedicate this walk to Mother Nature, to our mothers, to our grandmothers, and all the caregivers out there, because we need to take better care of each other and the world that we inhabit. And Mother's Day is a good day to celebrate the people who do that the best, the mothers and the grandmothers and the caregivers.
Well, that's beautiful, Jim. Again, this is the most wholesome presentation we've ever had. This is lovely. And for anyone who gets a chance when the world opens up to join Friends of the Rouge on a nature walk, or go to local, provincial, state, national parks to do this, it's a really enriching thing to get to experience nature in this way. Jim, before we wrap up, I just want to ask, for kids at home that want to do something about this, you guys planted a tree in your first program, and that's something that kids can do to give back. Is there anything else kids can do to help appreciate the flowers or ecosystems in their area, or help protect them, that you can share?
There's a couple things you could do. One is, over the last 30 years, Friends of the Rouge has involved 65,000 school and community volunteers, and we've planted 750,000 native trees, shrubs, and flowers representing over 150 species to restore wetlands and forests, to fight climate change, absorb carbon, stop flooding, and protect biodiversity. So once we're back in doing that, we have those programs, and we invite out schools and community groups. You can also visit, we have a website called Rouge National Park Friends, and you can visit that website. And in that website, you can actually send a letter to the Prime Minister and members of Parliament. It's really easy to do. You push on a button, you copy a letter with a right click, and that letter will encourage the federal government to actually implement the plans for combating climate change by putting back forests and wetlands, protecting biodiversity by putting back forests and wetlands, and developing really good management plans for this area. The Rouge is one of the most biologically diverse parcels of land in public ownership in all of Canada, because it's right at the blending point of the Caroline and mixed wood forest. So thank you, Explore by the Seat of Your Pants, and Jesse today for having us. And thank you for everybody for being here today. Thank you, Danielle, for filming. And I hope everybody had a good time and learned about the amazing biodiversity in the Rouge.
We sure did. Well, Jim and Danielle, thank you so much. A marvelous presentation. I've passed along in the YouTube chat bar the link to the Friends of the Rouge Watershed website, so everyone can check that out. And we look forward to hosting more programs with them over the coming weeks and months, so you can explore more of nature in Toronto and get inspired to explore nature wherever you are. For now, everyone, thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye for now, guys.